Welcome to Meyerside Chats, the podcast where leadership, innovation, and governance meet solutions-oriented thinking and civil discourse to shape better communities. Today, I'm honored to be joined by California State Senator Roger Niello. Senator Niello represents the 6th Senate District and brings decades of public service and business experience to Sacramento. He's currently the vice chair of Senate Budget Committee, amongst a bunch of committees, actually. And he's been a consistent advocate for fiscal responsibility, structural reform, and pragmatic governance. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, but you start out saying I've got to be civil?
Well, if we want more clicks, we might as well make this heated. Let's get into real fiery stuff.
Yeah, yell and scream. No, that's not my style.
That's how you get things done, right?
Yeah.
Yell and scream at each other.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So just to kick it off, you woke up this morning. I'm sure there's a ton on your mind about what's going on at the state level or maybe federal level. What's top of mind for you when you woke up this morning in all things politics?
I wake up usually a few times during the night and things occur to me that I have to get up and write down so that I can go back to sleep again. But we're on recess now, so top of mind are things that are going on in the district. I'm meeting with a young professionals group in Roseville on Friday morning, so I have to start thinking about what I'm going to say there. And then we'll be going back into session week after next, and for the final week of session, and I have several bills that are still alive, and I'll be thinking more about that. Now, you mentioned the 6th Senate District, which of course is my district. It's the east side of Sacramento County and South Placer County. And I think it's important for the viewers to know that we call this the Jay Leno District because this is the map of my district. Can you not see Jay Leno's profile in there? I couldn't help. I had to make sure we shared that with the audience.
Who calls it the Jay Leno District, just to be clear?
Well, I showed the map of the district to a friend of mine when I was running for Senate. When I first saw the map, that didn't even occur to me. And she said, it was on an email exchange, she said, that's the Jay Leno District. And I worked again, and I had to agree with her.
Well, Jay Leno, if you're listening to this, quick shout out to you for representing Senator Niello so well.
Right.
So tell us, you said a few of these bills are still alive. And, I think a lot of people don't understand, especially at the state level, how these things really work. So when you say alive, it was probably killed at some portion throughout the process. There's a long process for a bill to become law, which is actually quite comforting in a lot of ways. But what are those bills? Where did they get stopped? What are those bills? And just tell me a little bit about that process.
Well, probably the two most important bills to me are the one that deals with giving small businesses the right to cure an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Access defect without having been sued by it. We have a few predatory law firms in California that target small businesses, threaten to sue, but say they'll go away for $15,000. And that's what ends up happening. So, and the other one is, I think my communications director talked with you about what we call my title and summary bill. And that is a bill that would transfer to the legislative analyst the responsibility for writing title and summary statements on ballot propositions. Currently, it's in the hands of the Attorney General, which of course is a partisan elected official. And many times they have a bias on a particular proposition, and that bias will show when they write the short title and summary statement. And unfortunately, a lot of people make up their mind on how to vote based upon the title and summary statement as opposed to the detailed analyses, which the leg analyst writes anyway, so it'd be no trouble for them to write the title and summary statement, which would be a much less biased statement. Bill, obviously, Democratic leadership does not want to pass. Although I've gotten it out of the Senate Elections Committee 2 times in the last 3 years, but it gets killed in the Appropriations Committee in a rather opaque process, which we can talk about a little bit later, but it died there. That other bill, which we call the Right to Cure bill, actually a good example of bipartisan collaboration. I have half of the Democratic caucus, over half, as either joint authors or co-authors on that bill, plus my Republican colleagues, and it passed overwhelmingly out of the Senate. But that bill, it's not dead. It's still alive in the Assembly Judiciary Committee because the consultant of that committee doesn't like the bill. And so they refused to give me a hearing. So we're going to continue to work on that next year. And next year, I will also introduce once again the title and summary bill. So those are 2 that are important to me that are not going forward this year. So, but I do have 4 bills that are on the suspense file in the Assembly Appropriations Committee and 3 other bills that are going to the Assembly floor.
Just because, something that caught me, and it's so important because I read all the documentation in the booklets about bills, and I've had a lot of thoughts of my own about them. Sometimes it's lacking a lot of information. Sometimes it's completely biased. And having caught this potential for bias is great. But you mentioned that your Democratic colleagues do not support this.
Why? You mean the title and summary bill?
Correct.
Democratic leadership.
Leadership.
As I said, the bill has passed out of the Senate Elections Committee 2 times, once in 2023 and now in 2025. I think it was unanimous, and a Democrat is a joint author with me on the bill. So there is support among the troops, if you will, but I'm quite sure that the Attorney General is probably expressing his view on that committee to Democratic leadership. And the way the Appropriations Committee works is bills that are assigned to appropriations, and by the way, this bill has virtually no fiscal impact. They say it does, but the ledge analyst writes the detailed analyses. For him to write the title and summary statement really would be no additional expense. But nonetheless, sent to the Appropriations Committee, all bills are put on what's called the suspense file, and then bills are voted on to pull off of the suspense file and sent to the floor. But bills that are not voted on just stay on the suspense file, and at the end of the session, they die there. So there's no fingerprints. Nobody casts a vote for or against those bills. They just die in the darkness. That's why I said a few minutes ago, it's a very opaque process, heavily criticized, but nonetheless, it sticks. It was that way when I was in the Assembly, and it's that way still, and that's how that bill died.
And so why do you think he's conveying that message to Democratic leadership as the Attorney General?
Well, I don't know that he is, but I have to strongly suspect because it's unexplainable why that bill stays on the suspense file when it passes overwhelmingly out of the Elections Committee and never even gets a vote in the Appropriations Committee.
So you don't really know the answer to why, which
No,
is part of the opaqueness of what you're
exactly.
suggesting.
But I speculate that the Attorney General is probably opining in the background because the bill would take away from him the ability to editorialize on title and summary statements.
Oh boy, yeah.
And by the way, you're probably familiar with this redistricting proposal in California, and the governor and the Democratic leadership want to put a ballot measure on this coming November for the voters to vote on actual maps that will reduce Republican seats in Congress out of California. Let's just watch and see what that title and summary statement says when that ballot proposition goes to the voters. I suspect it will be a highly biased statement that will recruit support for the proposition as opposed to being completely impartial.
How come that's not so obvious in 2025 that it's taken us this long to see that the thing that people are voting on for the most part, right? There's like how far you go through your research and spend time to vote. You could spend months trying to understand the problem before making an educated vote, right? So this is supposed to help you make an informed vote in less time in a lot of ways. And if you only read, say, the summary or an analysis, you're only getting a piece of the puzzle anyway. Why do you think that it's not so obvious? Right? It's like the first layer of like transparency and authenticity in the voting process would be right there where the people open and look and read this very top line information. And we're still in 2025 dealing with like, okay, someone's editorializing potentially, like at the most basic level.
Well, it's not a new issue. I've been working on this since I was in the assembly I think it was somewhere around 2008. A constituent called my office and specifically suggested this as something that I had to work on. And I thought, yeah, that's not a bad idea. So I worked on it when I was in the assembly without success. But then when I was turned out of the assembly, a state senator, Gene Fuller, who my assembly chief of staff went to work for, she worked on it the entire time she was there. And then when she was termed out, Kevin Kiley was elected to the assembly, and then he picked it up and worked on it until he ran for Congress and won. And that was the same time that I came back in. So there have been Republicans working on this for 15 years. But again, not enough people are witnessing what's going on. And too many people rely on that title and summary statement. Maybe a better thing would be to just do away with it and force people to read the detail, which isn't that laborious anyway. But in any case, not enough people have noticed it. But there was a Proposition 47 about 10 years ago that was a criminal justice reform bill, quote unquote, called Proposition 47, which had lots of unintended consequences that a proposition passed last November intended to fix. Proposition 36, if you're familiar with it. But that original Proposition 47, which Kamala Harris as Attorney General wanted to pass, she gave it the title and summary statement, the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, which was obviously a bias. So, and that's been talked about a lot. So maybe people are becoming more aware of that.
It's about time, probably, because it must be going on through as long as there's been title and summary statements, if we're still dealing with it.
The Attorney General has had this responsibility forever. And there's examples of Republicans that snuck an editorial into a title and summary statement, too. It's just that in the last 25, 30 years, the Attorney General has almost always been a Democrat.
Yeah, and California, with such a supermajority, sometimes I think that, whatever side you're on, that there should be an awareness that there is such a supermajority and that a lot of what people are seeing are going to lean in that direction. And sometimes I don't know if it's clear enough that, we pride ourselves in diversity of thinking and diversity of people for all the different beautiful things that a diverse population brings to our society. And, this is an example of diversity of thinking. And if you lean too far in one direction, you're going to have problems with not having enough balance. And that seems fairly obvious to me as well. Whether you believe in one thing or not, part of the system is meant to balance each other so that things can operate, can coexist well, and you can have balanced legislation.
And I know a lot of Democrats not necessarily elected officials, although some elected officials that in private conversations will share that they do not think it's healthy to have such an imbalance in power in the state. And there are signs that somebody compared where we are in California to the mid 90s nationally when Newt Gingrich and Republicans took over Congress, and it was not expected. That was a surprise. And it wasn't because a whole bunch of Democrats became Republicans. It was because a whole bunch of Democrats voted Republican because they didn't like the way things were going. And I think it's instructive to note that President Trump got 40% of the vote in California in the last election, which exceeds the percentage of registered Republicans in the state, and in particular made gains with Black and brown voters, particularly young males. So there are some reactions. Unfortunately, not enough. There are still people that vote based upon the R or the D next to the name. And I think the last controllers race is a good example of that. Lonnie Chen was the Republican candidate, eminently qualified, a brilliant guy, and he received the endorsement of every major newspaper in the state, every one. But he still lost because too many people voted that were Democrats voted Democrat, although there were a lot that switched because he did receive more votes than any other statewide Republican running. But he didn't win, and he really should have.
Yeah. Yeah, I meet a lot of people that vote D down the line or R down the line, and I do also think that's unhealthy. And it doesn't allow for critical thinking either. It doesn't let you think, if you understand people have to put a D or an R, and a lot of people feel differently. Just because you have that, you may feel like you're a D in some ways or an R in other ways, and it doesn't allow for nuance. And this is something I've been sort of fighting for so long in civics, is like the ability to understand that there's nuance. It's not all or nothing all the time, just because you read a thing in headlines and you think that everyone fits into this category. And I hope we can do better.
And that gets back to civics education in the K through 12 system, which has been frankly lacking. I worked with the county superintendent of education here in Sacramento County, along with a judge and a former district superintendent, and to try to convince our school districts here to include civics education throughout the K through 12 spectrum, which every district in the county adopted a resolution with the exception of one. And then the pandemic hit, so it sort of hurt that progress. But we could do a much better job teaching civics and civic engagement. Engagement is really important. Every time we come up with a proposition to make it easier for people to register to vote and easier for people to vote, I always say, well, that's fine. But what we need to do is make sure that we have more educated and engaged voters. And that's what's really important in a democracy.
Right. Yeah, there is the argument is what's worse, someone not voting or being an uneducated voter. I've heard that line before. I think that's a philosophical question. It could probably go back and forth for a long time, but it is an outstanding question, and I don't know if we do a good enough job at getting people to think through how they would solve a problem and the right way of going about solving it. It's lacking.
I think our education of civics academically, as well as civic engagement, could be much better.
Yeah. So let's direct this sentiment and conversation towards California budgeting. With taking all that we just talked about and figuring out, that you've had such a strong focus on budget in the legislature. What is your assessment right now of the current budget challenges?
We're upside down. We had tremendous surpluses a couple of years before I was elected, and they were essentially spent. I think we need a much more disciplined approach toward establishing reserves, and I can talk about my thought on that in a moment. but we developed significant deficits. And the good news is the state still has a relatively healthy cash position. And this year's budget had a deficit we had to meet, that is, establish spending programs that exceeded expected revenues by about $12 billion. That's a lot of money, but that gap can be closed through a number of issues that avoid too much in the way of expense reductions. But the problem is that projecting the same situation out 2 to 4 years, we're going to be looking at $20 to $30 billion deficits and climbing until revenues come back in line with established spending programs. That's why it's called a structural deficit. And we're not doing enough now to identify programs that aren't working as well as was expected when they were started, so as to cut back or reduce those programs, because we're going to have significant budget challenges headed into the fiscal year after this one and the next 2 or 3 after that. And what's frustrating is I don't see that the leadership, which really has control because they have a supermajority, my weapon is my mouth, and I'm not always totally listened to. So that's frustrating, and we have challenges.
So when you're in these committee meetings, which is a mix of Democrats and Republicans, and you're talking about budget, do these things come up? Does this conversation come up in those committee meetings? Do you express these thoughts? Does it feel like you're at least somewhat hopeful about some of the work that's being done there?
There's 2 things that I continually bring up. I said one time that I apologize for being a broken record, and another member of the legislature who I worked with on the budget committee in the assembly walked up to me after I said that, and he said, given the age of people here, I suspect most people don't know what a broken record is.
That's a funny joke to tell in a situation like that, I think, right? Yeah.
But I always try to use humor along with my serious points. But there are 2 things that I continually bring up. One is that, which I just mentioned, and I can't say that it elicits a detailed discussion of the issue, but I get the point out. The other thing is that the essential final budget package, irrespective of all the committee meetings that we have, both the subcommittee meetings, which are there's subcommittees for various subjects of the budget, and then the full budget committee meeting. We do have those committee meetings, but essentially the final budget is developed through a meeting, closed-door meetings between the President Pro Tem, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the Governor. In other words, 3 Democrats. And that is also a somewhat opaque process. And I continually speak to that issue also. So those are the primary things that I talk about. And being a member of the superminority, my impact just depends on how people react to it, but I don't sense that it moves the needle all that much.
Do you think your Democratic colleagues would agree that the process is opaque?
Yes, I do. They're not going to admit it, but I think a lot of them agree with that. Because remember, I mentioned just 3 people. The rest of the Democrats, by and large, maybe the budget chairs in the Assembly and the Senate, and maybe a few others in leadership, but most of the rank and file Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate are not involved in those behind the door conversations. So yes, I would suspect that the frustration goes beyond my caucus.
You put forward the title and summary bill. Is there any other legislation that has been put forth to address the opaqueness? And do you wish there was some additional legislation to address this? How would you see this moving in a better direction and improving over time? Obviously, you can't fix this overnight, but like what can we do in addition to your bill to start fixing?
Most of the process that is less than transparent is process. It's not legislated, it's practice. And so the answer to that would be the hypothetical rhetorical question, if I were king, what would I do? And I would seek to improve all of these things. I've said time and again, with regard to the title and summary legislation, if a Republican was continually Attorney General, I would still support this legislation because it makes sense. And if Republicans all of a sudden gained control, would we change the suspense process in the Appropriations Committee? I would argue that we should. Would we open up those behind closed door meetings? I would argue that we should. I have to wait and see if the rest of my Republicans colleagues agreed with that, if we regain control. But again, those are process issues that really can't be fixed via legislation. Well, I shouldn't say they can't, but if it's the way the majority party wants it, a legislative approach wouldn't succeed.
Interesting. That's interesting. It's if you look at the chart of how often of California's flipping from Democrat to Republican and vice versa, it's almost that time, if not that time right now. I forget the exact chart, but it flips, right? When there's been, I don't want to say 30 or 40 years ago, it was Republican, and then 30 or 40 years before that, it was Democrat. And the polls switch, and the sentiment of what someone would normally be a Democrat becomes Republican, and sort of vice versa. And this happens every several decades. It's happened a number of times in California. Do you think that shift is on its way, or will it take longer this time, or will it never happen again? Which to me seems unlikely because things cycle. So where do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I never believe in never.
Me neither.
I have to look at this on a couple of different levels. One is, I mentioned before that President Trump received 40% of the vote, which exceeds the percentage of Republican registrations, and made inroads among particularly young men of color, which illustrates perhaps a trend in the direction that you state. But there are demographic migration. There's demographic migration that's going on. If you look back to the end of the Cold War, the defense industry was very large in California. This is early 1990s, right? And this was a Democratic state. California was a Republican state.
Right.
And the people, mostly Southern California people that were in the defense industry, moved out of the state. I believe a lot of them moved to Texas. Texas and Arizona. Arizona, I think, was a leaning blue state back then also. Texas and Arizona became Republican states, and California gradually became Democratic. And so it isn't just a matter of shifting attitudes because maybe one supermajority party goes a little too far in some areas. It's also the migration of people. And we have had a larger out-migration from California than an in-migration. And it appears that it's mostly Republicans moving out. Whether that means Republicans moving in or not, I don't know. But there are a lot of Republicans who have become frustrated with the supermajority, and they've moved to Tennessee, to Texas, areas like that.
Yes.
In fact, I've heard some people in Tennessee complain that Californians moving there is making the place more conservative. So we have the attitudinal changes, but we also have the demographic partisan net out migration that it can affect things too. So I submit all of that I will wrap up in a bow by saying, I don't know.
Well presented, well wrapped, and I also enjoy the bow.
Well, also the wrapping paper is kind of gray.
Oh, yeah. Like most things, that is a metaphor for life. The gray area, things are not black and white. There's nuance to everything.
Yep.
Critical thinking is required.
Yes.
Okay, I think our last question for today, because I wish I can do this for 2 or 3 hours with you, but that's not possible. So, AI. How is this being discussed in the legislature from, well, first, how is it impacting the operations day to day? But also, where do you see it going in the future, specifically around the legislature, the legislative process, and legislative operations?
Well, in the legislature, the issue is how do you regulate it? I have said many times, I have a lot of very talented, very smart colleagues, but frankly, we have 120 people here, 80 in the Assembly, 40 in the Senate, who are probably the least competent people to fully understand artificial intelligence and how to regulate it. I have not carried any artificial intelligence legislation myself, but I believe, so as not to discourage innovation, if we're going to regulate it, we should regulate what it does, not how it's developed. And some of the legislative efforts get into that latter area, and I think that controls it too much. But artificial intelligence is going to have a significant and profound effect on our economy, on the social issues, and in all sorts of ways. I think the job loss issue is probably overblown because we have had continual technological advances, especially over the last 150 years, that in human history is unprecedented. And in the Western world, it has done nothing but vastly improve and expand our economy. And I have a hard time believing that artificial intelligence will be any better. And people that lament job losses to artificial intelligence, I say, and I didn't author this, I heard from somebody else, so I forget who, but I believe it's true. You will not lose your job to artificial intelligence. You will lose your job to somebody who knows how to use artificial intelligence. It is an incredibly valuable tool. I use it myself for research purposes. There's several different platforms, and it is a powerful tool that people should learn how to use. It will help businesses become more productive. Again, people won't lose their job to artificial intelligence per se, but to people who know how to use it. And I'm the eternal optimist, and I think it'll be like all of the other technical innovations that we've had, especially in the last 150 years, and things will be better. But we do have to be careful. There can be negative consequences.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. Every time there's like a big thing that's going to disrupt something, there's always some, and this is a big one. I don't want to discount how big AI is, right? It's as big as, at least as big as, you know, it's the Industrial Revolution or the invention of the, you know, the internet or whatever, the agricultural revolution, the printing press, the steam engine, whatever, right? Like it's that big and it's touching everything. And you say to yourself, well, you know, I remember like when music sharing, peer-to-peer, Napster was the big thing.
Right.
And then at some point you say to yourself, look, free and productivity trump all. Things that are free that you can get for free, if it can be for free, and things that are or almost free, we'll say, or things that are radically productive to make your day easier, to give you more information, to help be more productive in your work, in your line of work, whatever. That just trumps all. It is what it is. It's not going anywhere. You can fight it all you want. You could say, oh, what are we going to do? We're all going to lose our jobs. Well, you may lose your job because you're not embracing what just is. I can't change it. It's just coming because it's productive and it's all just about free.
Learn how to use it and how it can be productive in your own life, both personally and from a business perspective.
That's it. Well, I very much enjoyed this conversation. I'm grateful for your time, your expertise, and for sharing what you have here today. And this was wonderful. Thanks so much again. And any last words you want to say to the world?
The world.
Communicate your last line to the world. What do you want to see for the whole world?
I want to see peace. I'm troubled by things that are going on around the world, and I want to see peace. And I'd like to see a better balance of power in California. We'll see how the 2026 election turns out on that score in California. And I'm up for re-election. It'll be my last one. I'll be turned out of the legislature after that, but I'll be hopeful for a little bit better balance of partisan power in the California state legislature. And I've enjoyed this too. And I'm glad that you reached out to me for something that had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with your podcast. But here we end up on your podcast. So I thank you for that.
This was great. Have a lovely day. We're on different time zones, so have a wonderful day, and we'll connect soon.
Okay. See you later.